Sign the ledger, Brooks. She's yours. The debt is settled, the broker sneered, shoving the bound Omega forward. Brooks, the alpha king of the Northern Syndicate, barely glanced at the trembling girl. He signed the contract with a violent flick of his pen, disgusted by the archaic trade of flesh for coin. Get out of my sight, he growled. He turned his back, expecting the Omega to cower. Instead, he heard a sharp intake of breath. Drop, Sloane whispered, her voice a sudden vibrating command that made Brooks's alpha blood freeze. Before he could react, she tackled him to the marble floor. A millisecond later, a high-caliber sniper round shattered the reinforced glass where his head had just been. Brooks stared up at her. The heavy silk hood concealing her features had fallen back, revealing slightly tapered, hyper-alert ears twitching toward the distant rooftop. She hadn't guessed. She had heard the trigger mechanism click from 400 yards away. The air inside the monolithic penthouse of the Obsidian Tower was thick with the scent of ozone, aged scotch, and the distinct, acrid stench of a terrified beta. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting elongated, weeping shadows across the imported Italian marble floor. Brooks stood by the glass, his broad, tailored shoulders tense beneath his charcoal suit. As the alpha king of the city's most ruthless commercial and subterranean empire, he was accustomed to dealing in high stakes. But the transaction currently dirtying his private office left a bitter taste in his mouth. Marcus, a low-level smuggler who had made the fatal mistake of embezzling $2 million from Brooks's shipping lanes, was sweating profusely onto the mahogany desk. "It's a fair trade, Mr. Brooks," Marcus stammered, dabbing his glistening forehead with a silk handkerchief. "More than fair. An unbonded Omega. Prime lineage. The market value alone—" "I don't deal in people, Marcus," Brooks interrupted, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated in the chest of every person in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer, suffocating weight of his alpha pheromones smelling of sharp cedar, cold iron, and imminent violence was enough to bring the smuggler to his knees. "You owe me money. Cash. Assets. Not a breathing liability." "She's an asset," Marcus practically shrieked, gesturing wildly to the corner of the room. Brooks finally shifted his glacial, piercing blue gaze to the shadows. Standing perfectly still, flanked by two of Marcus's heavily armed guards, was the Omega. She was draped in an oversized, heavy wool cloak, the deep cowl pulled low over her face. She was incredibly small compared to the towering alphas in the room, her posture rigid. Yet, unlike the typical unbonded Omega, there was no scent of distress leaking from her, no sweet, cloying aroma of submission or fear. She smelled like absolutely nothing. It was unnatural. "She's broken," Brooks noted, his eyes narrowing. "Or suppressed. I have no use for a medicated Omega." "She's not medicated. She's unique," Marcus bargained, his voice cracking. "Sloane. Her name is Sloane. Just sign the debt transfer ledger. Please, if I don't settle this tonight, the council will have my head." Brooks stared at the cloaked figure for a long, calculating moment. He didn't want an Omega. His life was a meticulously orchestrated war zone of corporate takeovers and territorial defense. The last thing he needed was a fragile creature requiring protection and biological management. But the council was watching. If he executed Marcus over a petty $2 million, it would spark a messy turf war with the southern factions. With a slow, deliberate exhale, Brooks walked to the desk. He picked up the heavy ruthenium Mont Blanc pen. The cold metal grounded him. $2 million, Brooks said softly, the sound scraping like gravel. "The debt is settled. If I ever see your face in my territory again, Marcus, I won't ask for a repayment. I'll take your hands." He signed the ledger. The ink was barely dry when the broker shoved the Omega forward and scrambled out the door, his guards trailing like frightened dogs. Brooks stood alone in the expansive office with his new property. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, an impending migraine throbbing at his temples. "Take the hood off," he commanded, pouring himself a measure of scotch. "Let's see what $2 million of wasted capital looks like." Sloane didn't move. Brooks turned, an irritated growl building in his throat. He was an alpha. His commands were biologically wired to be obeyed by Omegas. I said. A sharp, violent twitch. The heavy wool of her cowl rustled, Sloane's head snapped toward the reinforced bulletproof glass of the western window. The storm was raging outside, a chaotic symphony of thunder and rain. But Sloane wasn't listening to the storm. "Drop," she whispered. The word wasn't a plea. It was a precise, cutting frequency that seemed to bypass Brooks's ears and hit his nervous system directly. It was an involuntary, instinctual command. Before his rational brain could process the indignity of an Omega giving him an order, Sloane moved. She didn't cower. She lunged. For a creature so small, her speed was blinding. She hit Brooks squarely in the chest, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs and sending the crystal glass flying. They crashed to the hard marble, Brooks twisting instinctively to shield her, his combat training overriding his shock. A millisecond later, the room exploded. A high-caliber, armor-piercing round fired from a suppressed rifle shattered the inch-thick ballistic glass. The air pressure in the room violently equalized, sucking papers and debris into a vortex of rain and wind. The bullet buried itself into the mahogany paneling exactly where Brooks's skull had been stationed a second prior. Brooks lay on the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Omega, Sloane, was pinned beneath him. Her hood had fallen back in the struggle. Brooks stared down at her. She possessed an ethereal, striking face, with sharp cheekbones and piercing, kaleidoscopic hazel eyes that were currently dilated with adrenaline. But what caught Brooks's breath were her ears. They were slightly tapered at the tips, elegant but distinctly modified. And right now, they were pivoting independently, twitching with micro-movements like radar dishes, locked onto an invisible target. She hadn't guessed. She hadn't seen a laser. 400 yards. Sloane breathed, her voice a tight, strained rasp. Her eyes weren't looking at him. They were staring through the shattered window into the tempest. Rooftop of the Vanguard building. He just ejected the casing. The brass hit concrete. He's rechambering. Brooks's blood ran cold. The Vanguard building was completely obscured by the storm. It was impossible to see, let alone hear a sniper's bolt action over the thunder. But as her right ear twitched violently again, she clamped her hands over her head with a hiss of pain. "Move," she screamed. Brooks didn't question her. He grabbed her waist, hauling her behind the massive, solid oak desk just as a second round obliterated the wall behind them. He had bought an Omega to settle a debt. He had just realized he had purchased a human radar. The penthouse was plunged into darkness as the secondary security protocols triggered, severing the main power and activating the reinforced steel shutters. The agonizing screech of metal grinding against metal echoed through the room as the heavy blast doors slid over the shattered windows, finally sealing them off from the howling storm and the sniper's line of sight. Emergency red lighting bathed the ruined office in a bloody glow. Brooks drew his sidearm, a custom-machined tactical pistol, keeping his body positioned between the door and the trembling Omega. He tapped his comms earpiece. "Vance. Status." Static crackled, followed by the deep, urgent voice of his head of security. "Boss, we heard the breach. Outer perimeter is secure. Lockdowns engaged. Are you hit?" "Negative." "Assassin on the Vanguard rooftop. Suppressed rifle. Send a cleanup crew immediately. I want him alive." "Copy that." Moving on Vanguard, Brooks lowered the weapon slightly, turning his attention back to the woman huddled against the base of his desk. Sloane was curled into a tight ball, her hands pressed so hard against the sides of her head that her knuckles were white. She was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, her entire body shaking violently. The scent of her finally hit him. It wasn't the typical floral or honeyed scent of a distressed Omega. It was the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and crushed mint, the scent of an overloaded nervous system. "Hey," Brooks said, keeping his voice carefully modulated. He knew better than to approach a panicked animal, let alone a human who had just saved his life. He holstered his weapon and slowly sank into a crouch a few feet away. "The shutters are down. The room is soundproofed now. It's over." Sloane squeezed her eyes shut. "It's not over," she gasped through gritted teeth. "The sirens, the shouting, the frequency of the lockdown alarms. It's too loud. Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Brooks frowned. The lockdown alarms were completely silent to the human ear. They were a sub-audible security frequency meant to alert his alpha guards without tipping off intruders. but Sloane was reacting to them as if they were screaming sirens in a confined space. Vance. Brooks barked into his comms. Kill the internal lockdown alarms. Now. Sir? That violates protocol. Do it. The red lights blinked, and suddenly, the oppressive, vibrating pressure in the room vanished. Sloane let out a long, shuddering exhale. Her hands slowly lowered from her head. She slumped against the dark wood of the desk, looking completely exhausted. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the sound of their combined breathing. Brooks observed her closely. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. The delicate, pointed tips of her ears were flushed red. How did you do that? Brooks asked, his tone demanding but devoid of its usual aggressive alpha edge. The sniper. The Vanguard building is over 4 football fields away. In a monsoon, Sloane kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor. I heard the metal, she whispered, her voice raw. The friction of the bolt pulling back, the specific friction coefficient of a carbon fiber bipod dragging across wet concrete, the slowing of a human heartbeat right before the trigger pull. Brooks stared at her, his strategic mind spinning rapidly. Omegas had heightened senses, yes. They were naturally empathetic, able to sense emotional changes in their mates. But this wasn't biology. This was a mutation, a dangerous, incredibly valuable mutation. Who else knows about this? Brooks asked, stepping closer. Sloane flinched at his movement, instinctively shrinking back. My pack knew. They thought I was cursed. Too sensitive. Too fragile. I couldn't handle the noise of normal life, so they kept me sedated in a basement for 5 years. When they went bankrupt, Marcus bought my debt. He didn't know what I was. He just knew I was an unbonded Omega with a pedigree. He kept me heavily drugged so I wouldn't scream. A cold, unfamiliar surge of protective fury flared in Brooks's chest. The thought of this woman, this highly tuned instrument being locked in a dark room and pumped full of narcotics made his alpha instincts roar. He ruthlessly shoved the instinct down. He was a king, not a savior. The drugs are wearing off now, Sloane continued, her voice trembling as she finally looked up at him. The kaleidoscope of gold, green, and brown in her eyes was striking in the red emergency light. That's why I could hear it. But without the suppressants, everything is too loud. Your heartbeat, Mr. Brooks. It's beating at exactly 92 beats per minute. The blood rushing through your carotid artery sounds like a waterfall. It's deafening. Brooks felt a chill run down his spine. She wasn't just a radar. She was a biological lie detector. An omniscient listener. He stood up, offering his hand. Sloane stared at his large, calloused palm, hesitation etched into every line of her face. I am not Marcus, and I am not your pack, Brooks said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing register meant to pacify. You are in my territory now. You saved my life. That means you are under my protection. I am your property, she corrected bitterly, ignoring his hand and using the desk to pull herself up. You bought my debt. I bought a liability, Brooks countered, his eyes flashing. I am standing in front of an asset, and I protect my assets, Sloane. Come with me. The cleaners are coming to scrub this room, and I need to get you to the estate. Sloane looked around the shattered room, then back at Brooks. She had no choice. She was unbonded, broke, and the target of whatever faction was trying to kill the Alpha King. She nodded slowly. As they walked toward the private elevator, Sloane paused. Her left ear gave a microscopic twitch. Brooks, she murmured, stopping dead in her tracks. He turned, hand instantly going to his holster. What is it? The men coming up the south stairwell, she said, her eyes widening in realization. Their boots. They aren't wearing standard-issue tactical soles like Vance's men. They're wearing silent step infiltration gear, and their heart rates. They aren't elevated from rushing to secure the building. They're calm, controlled. Brooks's jaw clenched. The outer perimeter hadn't been secured. It had been breached. The sniper was just a distraction to drive him into the lockdown zone. How many? Brooks asked, his voice deadly quiet. 6, Sloane said, swallowing hard. 4 floors down, moving fast. Brooks hit the emergency stop on the elevator and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the hidden armory behind his bookshelf. The Omega wasn't just a weapon. She was his only tactical advantage in a building quickly filling with ghosts. The extraction from the obsidian tower had been a masterpiece of violent efficiency. Guided purely by Sloane's whispered directions in the dark, Brooks and Vance's loyalists had ambushed the infiltration team in the stairwell. Sloane had pinpointed their exact locations through the concrete walls by the sound of their breathing and the rustle of their synthetic armor. Brooks had moved like a shadow, lethal and precise, executing the threats before they even knew they were being hunted. Now, 3 days later, Sloane sat by the expansive window of her suite in High Ridge, Brooks's heavily fortified, brutalist estate nestled in the mountains outside the city. The room was a gilded cage. It was massive, adorned with minimalist luxury, plush rugs, and soft lighting. But more importantly, Brooks had brought in acoustic engineers within hours of their arrival. The walls were lined with state-of-the-art sound-dampening panels. The windows were triple-paned vacuum glass. Inside this room, the world was blessedly, beautifully silent. It was the first time in her life Sloane hadn't needed drugs to stop the agonizing cacophony of the world. She was currently brushing her wet hair, wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater Brooks had provided. The scent of cedar and storm was faintly woven into the fabric, acting as a grounding mechanism for her frayed nerves. The heavy, soundproof oak door clicked open. Sloane didn't need to look up. She had heard his footsteps a corridor away. Recognizing the unique, authoritative cadence of his stride, Brooks entered, carrying a silver tray with a steaming cup of tea and a small plate of food. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his ice-blue eyes darker than before. He set the tray on the small table near her chair. "Chamomile," Brooks said gruffly. "Vance said it's supposed to help with whatever it is you go through when the adrenaline drops." "Thank you," Sloane murmured, setting the brush down. She pulled her hair back, consciously allowing her tapered ears to remain visible. It was a test, a small act of defiance. Brooks's gaze flicked to her ears, but his expression remained impassive. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive frame making the plush furniture look miniature. "The men in the stairwell belong to the Thorn Cartel," Brooks stated, skipping any pleasantries. "Western Territory. They've been encroaching on my shipping lines, but an outright assassination attempt on my home soil is an escalation I didn't anticipate." "Why are you telling me this?" Sloane asked, wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. "I'm just the dead." "Stop saying that," Brooks snapped, a flash of genuine alpha irritation bleeding through his control. The sudden spike in his pheromones made the air in the room feel heavy. "You ceased being a det the second you pulled me out of the trajectory of a 338 Lapua Magnum. You are a member of this household now." Sloane raised an eyebrow. "A member of the household who is not allowed past the East Wing without an armed escort. A member who is currently residing in a very expensive, very quiet cell. It's for your protection," Brooks argued, his jaw tightening. "And for your sanity. You told me the noise of the city felt like a physical assault. Here, you have peace. I have isolation," she countered softly. "There's a difference." Brooks stared at her, studying the defiance in her posture. Most Omegas would be melting into a puddle of submissive gratitude in the presence of an Alpha King providing for them. Sloane sat ramrod straight, analyzing him right back. "I need your help, Sloane," Brooks finally admitted. The admission seemed to physically pain him. Sloane's heart gave a slight flutter, but she maintained her composure. "My help? Tomorrow night, I am hosting a neutral ground summit at the estate," Brooks explained. "Thorn will be here, along with the heads of the 3 other major syndicates. I cannot retaliate for the assassination attempt without proof that the council will accept. If I strike first without cause, they will all unite against me. And you want me to listen to them," Sloane realized, the pieces clicking together. "You want me to be your human polygraph. I want you to be my secret weapon," Brooks corrected, a dangerous, predatory smile curving his lips. "You will attend the dinner as my companion. You will be seated next to me. I will wear a micro-receiver in my ear. You will wear a transmitter ring. You tap the ring once for a lie, twice for truth, 3 times for a threat." Sloane looked down at her hands. The power dynamic was shifting so rapidly it gave her whiplash. Days ago, she was a drugged captive waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Now, the most powerful alpha in the region was asking her to be the linchpin in a high-stakes political chess match. "They will smell me," Sloane pointed out. I am an unbonded Omega, walking into a room full of Alpha Syndicate bosses. It will be a bloodbath. They will challenge you for me. Let them try, Brooks growled, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a possessive territorialism that made the fine hairs on Sloane's arms stand up. You will wear my scent. I will mark you with my pheromones before we go down. To them, you will belong to me. Completely untouchable. The thought of being coated in his scent, the heavy, intoxicating aroma of cedar and power, made a strange heat pool in Sloane's stomach. It was a biological reaction, entirely involuntary, but entirely terrifying. And if I refuse? She asked, testing the boundaries of her cage. Brooks leaned closer. She could hear the steady, powerful thumping of his heart. It wasn't angry. It was intensely focused. If you refuse, you stay in this room. You remain safe. I will handle Thorn my way, which will likely result in a war that burns half the city to the ground. But I will not force you, Sloane. The choice is yours. He wasn't lying. She listened to the micro-tremors in his vocal cords, the steady rhythm of his blood. He was giving her actual autonomy. Sloane looked into his eyes. She saw the ruthless king, but beneath it, she heard the exhausted man holding a crumbling empire together. Bring me the ring, Sloane said softly. The grand dining hall of High Ridge was a masterclass in intimidation. Black marble, roaring fireplaces, and a massive mahogany table that looked more like a war room map than a place to eat. Sloane stood in front of the full-length mirror in Brooks's private chambers, her hands shaking slightly. She was dressed in a sleek, floor-length emerald gown that left her shoulders bare. Her hair was elegantly swept up, purposefully exposing the delicate taper of her ears. She looked like royalty, but she felt like a soldier stepping onto a minefield. Brooks stepped into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke midnight blue suit. He paused when he saw her, his breath catching audibly. Sloane heard the sudden, microscopic spike in his heart rate. You look. Brooks started, clearing his throat. Adequate. Sloane smirked, her anxiety briefly overridden by amusement. Your heart rate just jumped 12 beats per minute, Alpha. Adequate is a lie. A low rumble of a laugh vibrated in Brooks's chest as he closed the distance between them. I'm going to have to watch my thoughts around you, aren't I? You're going to have to watch your heart, she corrected gently. The playfulness vanished from Brooks's eyes, replaced by a dark, intense heat. He stepped directly into her personal space. It's time, he murmured. I need to scent you. I apologize in advance. It will be heavy. Sloane nodded, tilting her neck slightly. Brooks leaned down, his face burying into the crook of her neck. He didn't bite, he wasn't claiming her, but he rubbed his scent glands against her pulse point with firm, deliberate pressure. The smell of cedar, storm, and pure, dominant alpha enveloped her. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and deeply comforting all at once. Sloane let out an involuntary, soft keen, her omega instincts responding to the overwhelming claim of protection. Brooks pulled back, his eyes flashing silver for a fraction of a second, the wolf beneath the skin acknowledging the sound. He swallowed hard, taking a step back. The transmitter ring is on your right index finger. Keep your hands on your lap. Do not speak unless spoken to by the other alphas. Let them think you are just a pretty, submissive pet. They won't know what hit them, Sloane promised. 10 minutes later, the double doors of the dining hall opened. The atmosphere inside was thick with competing aggressive pheromones. 4 rival alpha bosses sat around the table. At the far end sat Thorn, a heavily scarred, hulking alpha who smelled of stale blood and cheap cologne. The moment Brooks entered with Sloane on his arm, the room went dead silent. Every eye locked onto her. Every alpha nose flared, analyzing her. Sloane could hear their collective heart rates spike in predatory interest, followed immediately by a sharp drop as the overwhelming scent of Brooks's claim hit them. She was off limits. Brooks, Thorn purred, leaning back in his chair. I see you've brought a distraction. Unbonded, but heavily marked. An interesting flex for a peace summit. She is my companion, Thorn. Mind your eyes, or I'll remove them, Brooks said casually, pulling out a chair for Sloane before taking his own seat at the head of the table. Dinner was a torturous affair of veiled threats, posturing, and political maneuvering. Sloane kept her head demurely bowed, focusing entirely on her hearing. It was exhausting. She had to filter out the clinking of silverware, the crackling of the fire, and the breathing of the guards, isolating only the vocal cords and heartbeats of the men at the table. I had nothing to do with the incident at the Obsidian Tower. Thorne lied smoothly, cutting into his steak. Sloane's finger twitched. Tap. Lie. Brooks took a sip of his wine. Interesting. Because the munitions used were traced back to a Western shipping container. Your territory. A coincidence. A cartel boss named Volkov chimed in. Or a frame job. None of us want war, Brooks. Sloane focused on Volkov. His heart rate was steady, his vocal cords relaxed. Tap, tap. Truth. We respect the current borders, Thorne added, leaning forward. My men haven't crossed the river in 6 months. Sloane homed in on Thorne. His heart was hammering a rapid, deceptive rhythm. The micro-muscle spasms in his jaw indicated immense stress. Tap. Lie. Then, Thorne smiled, a cruel, jagged thing. But speaking of borders, Brooks, I hear you've been expanding your portfolio, acquiring exotic assets, buying up debts from low-level smugglers. Tell me, is the little freak with the bat ears worth the $2 million? The room temperature plummeted. Sloane froze. Thorne knew. He knew who she was, and he knew how Brooks had acquired her. Careful, Thorne. Brooks warned, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. Thorne ignored him, staring directly at Sloane. Her pack from the Oak Haven Valley, right? They used to rent her out to the underground casinos to listen to the roulette wheels before her mutation drove her insane. I offered to buy her a year ago to use as a hunting dog, but they said she was defective. Tell me, sweetheart, what exactly are you listening to right now? Sloane's breathing hitched. The trauma of her past, the dark basement, the drugs, it all came rushing back. Her heart rate skyrocketed. Thorne, Brooks snarled, half rising from his chair, his alpha presence exploding into the room like a physical shockwave. But Sloane reached out under the table and grabbed Brooks's thigh. She squeezed hard. She focused every ounce of her willpower, tuning out her own panic, tuning out Brooks's rage. She locked onto Thorne. She listened past his heartbeat. She listened to the rustle of his clothing. She listened to his pockets, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible electronic whine. Sloane tapped the ring. Tap, tap, tap. Threat. Then, she did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She utilized the offensive capability of her mutation. Sloane opened her mouth and let out a scream. But it wasn't a normal sound. It was an ultrasonic frequency, pitched so perfectly, so devastatingly high, that it bypassed human hearing and struck the delicate inner ear structures of the alphas in the room like a physical hammer. Every alpha, except Brooks, whom she subconsciously directed the cone of sound away from, screamed in agony, clutching their bleeding ears and collapsing to the floor. Glass shattered. The crystal chandelier above them exploded into a shower of diamonds. Thorne hit the ground, violently convulsing. From his jacket pocket, a small black device rolled out onto the carpet. A detonator. He hadn't come to talk. He had come to blow the room. Sloane cut the frequency off, instantly collapsing forward, her nose bleeding freely onto the white tablecloth. She had used herself as a weapon, and the recoil was devastating. Brooks was moving before she hit the table. He kicked the detonator across the room, drew his weapon, and put a bullet through Thorne's shoulder, pinning him to the floor. "Guards!" Brooks roared, scooping Sloane's limp body into his arms. "Secure the perimeter. Lock them all in chains." He looked down at Sloane. She was unconscious, pale as death. The secret weapon had fired, and it had nearly broken itself in the process. Sloane woke to the sensation of absolute, enveloping silence, and the gentle touch of a cool, damp cloth against her forehead. She opened her eyes slowly. The harsh light of the dining hall was gone, replaced by the soft, ambient glow of Brooks's private chambers. She was lying in the center of a massive, king-sized bed, surrounded by dark silk sheets that smelled overwhelmingly of him. Brooks was sitting on the edge of the mattress. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked wrecked. The usual impenetrable mask of the Alpha King had shattered, leaving behind a man vibrating with anxiety. "Don't move," Brooks ordered softly, his voice thick with emotion. The estate doctor was here. He said your eardrums aren't ruptured, but you suffered a severe concussive shock to your own nervous system. You bled from your nose and ears. Thorn? Sloane rasped. Her throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. In the dungeons. Singing like a bird after Vance spent an hour with him, Brooks replied, his jaw ticking angrily. He had a localized EMP and a micro-explosive rig strapped to his chest. He was going to take out the entire syndicate leadership and himself to pave the way for his son to take over. You stopped a massacre. Sloane closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. I told you I was a weapon. Brooks set the cloth down and carefully, hesitantly, took her hand. His large, calloused fingers enveloped hers. A weapon is an object, Sloane. Used and discarded. What you did out there. You nearly destroyed yourself to protect me. Why? You protected me first, she whispered, looking up at him. At the obsidian tower. And you gave me silence. No one has ever given me silence before. A heavy, poignant tension settled over the bed. The artificial boundaries they had constructed Alpha and Omega, owner and debt, were disintegrating, burned away by the fires of shared trauma. Tell me about Oakhaven, Brooks said quietly, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. Thorn said they used you. Sloane swallowed the lump in her throat. The memory was a jagged pill. I was born with this. Hyperacuity. At first, it was just a parlor trick. I could hear a deer a mile away. But as I went through puberty, my Omega biology amplified it. It became unbearable. I could hear the microscopic friction of insects in the walls. I could hear the blood flowing in people's veins. It drove me into sensory overload. She paused, a tear slipping down her cheek. Brooks wiped it away with infinite gentleness. My Alpha, my father, she continued bitterly. Realized I could hear the tumblers in a safe falling into place. I could hear the heartbeats of men playing cards, knowing instantly when they bluffed. He rented me out to the syndicates. I was a tool, but the noise, it was torture. Every loud sound was a physical blow. Eventually, I started screaming to drown it out. That's when I discovered I could project the frequency. I ruptured my father's eardrums during a panic attack. Brooks's eyes darkened to a storm cloud gray, a terrifying, lethal fury rolling off him in waves. He locked you in the basement and pumped me full of sedatives so I wouldn't use my voice again, Sloane confirmed, looking away. When the pack went bankrupt, Marcus took me as collateral. You know the rest. I am going to burn Oakhaven to the ground, Brooks stated. Not as a threat, but as a sworn oath. No, Sloane said, squeezing his hand. They are nothing to me anymore. Let them rot in their own failure. I don't want revenge, Brooks. I just want to stop running. Brooks looked down at her, the lethal Alpha fading into something entirely different. A mate. The realization hit Sloane like a physical force. His pheromones weren't just protective anymore. They were laced with deep, biological affection. He was courting her. You don't have to run ever again, Brooks murmured, leaning down. He pressed his lips to her forehead, lingering there. You are not a debt, Sloane. You are the queen of this syndicate, if you want to be, and anyone who looks at you as a weapon will answer to me. For the first time in her life, Sloane listened to the heartbeat of an Alpha, and she didn't hear a lie, a threat, or an ulterior motive. She heard absolute, terrifying devotion. Okay, she whispered, leaning into his touch. But as the peaceful moment settled, Sloane's right ear twitched. A sharp, microscopic movement. Her eyes snapped open, the vulnerability vanishing, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating radar. Brooks, she said, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. He immediately pulled back, his hand going to the weapon on the nightstand. What? The guards outside the door, Sloane said, sitting up, ignoring the spinning in her head. It's usually two men, Miller and Hayes. I know their heart rates. I know the squeak of Miller's left boot. And they're gone, Sloane breathed. There are 4 new heartbeats out there. Fast, adrenaline spiked, and I hear the distinctive hum of thermal optic cloaking tech. Brooks was instantly on his feet, racking the slide of his pistol. Thorn's attack hadn't been a solo mission. The betrayal ran deeper than a rival boss. The call was coming from inside the house. The heavy oak door of the bedroom suddenly blew inward, splintered by a shaped breaching charge. Smoke and fire flooded the quiet sanctuary. Brooks moved with blinding speed, grabbing Sloane and hauling her off the bed just as a hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the mattress where they had been resting seconds prior. He shoved her behind the massive, solid marble pillars of the en-suite bathroom, returning fire blindly into the smoke. 2 bodies hit the floor in the hallway, but more footsteps rushed in. "Thermal optics!" Brooks shouted over the din. "They can see our heat signatures through the smoke. Keep your head down." Sloane clamped her hands over her ears, the concussive blasts of the gunfire echoing painfully in her skull. But she couldn't afford to be paralyzed. She forced her hands down, closing her eyes and leaning into the chaos. The smoke blinded her, but her ears painted a perfect, terrifying 3D map of the room. "3 inside the room!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the ringing. 2 flanking left, moving behind the sofa. 1 taking cover behind the dresser on the right. Brooks didn't hesitate. Trusting her implicitly, he pivoted left, firing a double tap through the thick smoke at the exact trajectory she indicated. 2 heavy thuds confirmed the kills. He spun to the right, but the 3rd assassin had anticipated the movement, lunging forward with a tactical combat knife, knocking Brooks's gun away. The 2 massive alphas collided, crashing into a glass display cabinet. Sloane listened to the brutal, close-quarters combat. The sickening crunch of bone, the ragged gasps for air. Brooks was a lethal fighter, but the assassin was heavily armored and fighting with the desperate frenzy of a suicide squad. "Brooks!" Sloane cried out, hearing the assassin gain the upper hand, the hiss of the knife slicing through Brooks's sleeve. She had to do something. She couldn't use her destructive scream, she was too weak, and in this enclosed space, she would deafen Brooks permanently. She needed precision. She focused her hearing on the assassin. Not his heartbeat, not his breathing. She focused on the high-frequency hum of his thermal optic goggles. The electronic whine was a specific, artificial pitch. Sloane took a deep breath, filling her lungs to capacity. She pinpointed the exact resonant frequency of the goggles. Instead of a scream, she released a sharp, sustained, piercing whistle. It was a sound like a crystal glass vibrating right before it shatters. The sound wave shot across the room, perfectly tuned to the electronics. The assassin suddenly shrieked, dropping his knife and clawing at his face. The optics on his visor sparked violently, the localized acoustic resonance shattering the delicate internal glass and short-circuiting the battery directly into his eyes. Brooks capitalized on the distraction instantly. He threw off the blinded man, retrieved his weapon, and neutralized the threat. The room fell deadly silent, save for the crackling of small fires from the breaching charge. Brooks stood amidst the wreckage, panting heavily, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his bicep. He looked at Sloane, who was slumped against the marble, exhausted but unharmed. "You blew his optics," Brooks said in disbelief, kicking the fried helmet away. "Resonance," Sloane rasped, rubbing her throat. "Everything has a frequency. You just have to find it." Brooks rushed to her, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "I need Vance. I need my security team. Where the hell is my inner circle?" Sloane froze against his chest. She closed her eyes, casting her hearing out past the ruined bedroom, down the corridors, through the floors of the massive estate. She sifted through the noise of the panic, the shouting of the lower-level guards. She found the command center. She found Vance. He was shouting orders, mobilizing the defenses. But then, she found another heartbeat, one she recognized. "Brooks," Sloane said, her blood running cold. She pulled back to look into his eyes. "The inner circle isn't coming to help you. The inner circle let them in." "What are you talking about?" Brooks demanded, his expression hardening. "Silas," Sloane whispered, Brooks's second in command. "The man who managed the estate's security protocols. I can hear him in the lower sub-level. He's not running toward the fight. He's at the main server terminal. His heart rate is perfectly calm. He's manually overriding the perimeter defenses. He's locking us in." The betrayal hit Brooks like a physical blow. Silas, a man he had fought beside for a decade, a man he trusted like a brother. The pieces fell into place. Thorne's attack at the dinner was a distraction. While Brooks was focused on the rival cartel boss, Silas was neutralizing the loyalists and executing a coup from within. He wants the syndicate, Brooks snarled, a terrifying feral growl vibrating in his chest. His eyes flashed pure wolf. He used Thorn, and now he's cleaning house to take the throne. Brooks stood up, pulling Sloane with him. The protective alpha instinct was fully intertwined with the cold, calculating fury of a betrayed king. Can you track him? Brooks asked, reloading his weapon with mechanical precision. Sloane nodded, her jaw set. He's moving toward the armory. He thinks we're dead in this room. He's going to arm his loyalists and wipe out anyone still standing. Not today, Brooks said. He looked at her, no longer seeing a fragile Omega, but a tactical partner. We hunt him together. Keep your ears open, Sloane. Tell me every move he makes before he makes it. I'm on him, she promised, her ears twitching, locking onto the traitor's pulse like a guided missile. The descent into the lower levels of High Ridge was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The estate, usually a beacon of modern luxury, had become a war zone. Emergency strobe lights flickered, casting disorienting shadows, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Brooks moved with deadly silence, a shadow stalking the corridors. Sloane was plastered to his back, acting as his navigator. She was his eyes in the dark, his warning system. 2 guards, 50 feet ahead. Waiting around the corner, Sloane whispered directly into his ear. They have shotguns. Their breathing is erratic. They're scared. Brooks held up a hand, pausing. He reached to his tactical belt, pulling a flashbang grenade. He primed it, held up 3 fingers, and counted down. 3, 2, 1. He banked the grenade off the wall. The concussive bang was deafening, even to Brooks, but Sloane had clamped her hands over her ears seconds before, shielding herself. Brooks swept the corner before the flash had even faded, neutralizing the stunned guards with 2 suppressed shots. Clear, he muttered. Sloane uncovered her ears, wincing slightly. Silas is on the move. He left the armory. He's heading toward the central atrium. He's rallying his men for a final sweep, Brooks deduced. If he gets to the atrium, he controls the high ground and the main exits. We have to intercept. As they moved, Sloane couldn't help but marvel at the synergy between them. Brooks didn't doubt her for a second. When she said stop, he stopped. When she said left, he moved left. There was no alpha ego, no questioning her judgment. In this crucible of violence, they were a perfectly synchronized unit. The biological imperative of Alpha and Omega had evolved into something entirely modern and lethal. The sword and the radar. They reached the mezzanine overlooking the central atrium. It was a massive, multi-level space with glass elevators and steel walkways. Below them, Silas stood in the center of the floor, flanked by a dozen heavily armed defectors from Brooks's own security detail. Silas was a tall, lean alpha with calculating gray eyes. He was pacing, barking orders into a radio. Sweep the east wing. If Brooks is dead, I want his body. If he's alive, burn him out. And find the Omega. Thorn wants her alive. Brooks tensed beside Sloane, a low, murderous growl escaping his lips. Don't, Sloane whispered, gripping his arm. There are too many. If you open fire now, they'll tear you apart. I can't let him consolidate his forces, Brooks argued quietly. Sloane closed her eyes, analyzing the acoustic environment of the atrium. It was a cavernous space, full of hard surfaces. Glass, steel, marble. It was an echo chamber. Look at the glass roof, Sloane said softly. Brooks looked up. The atrium was crowned by a massive, domed skylight made of heavy architectural glass. If I hit the resonant frequency of that glass dome, Sloane calculated, her mind racing, it will shatter. Tons of glass falling directly on their position. Can you do it from here? Brooks asked, looking at her with a mixture of awe and concern. Without hurting yourself? I don't know, Sloane admitted honestly. I've never tried to project a frequency that high over this distance. But I don't have to break it completely. I just need to stress it. She looked at Brooks's rifle. If I find the pitch and hold it, the glass will weaken. You shoot the central support strut while it's vibrating. The kinetic impact combined with the acoustic stress will cause a catastrophic failure. Brooks looked at her, his icy eyes blazing with respect. Do it. Sloane stepped to the edge of the mezzanine, concealing herself behind a concrete pillar. She took a deep, centering breath. She tuned out the shouting below. She tuned out Silas's traitorous voice. She focused entirely on the massive pane of glass above them. She imagined the molecular structure, the tension in the framework. She opened her mouth and unleashed a silent scream. It was a pure ultrasonic note. To the men below, nothing happened. But Brooks saw it. The massive glass dome above began to shimmer. Dust shook loose from the steel rafters. A microscopic hairline fracture appeared in the center of the pane, webbing outward like ice on a frozen lake. Sloane clamped her hands onto the concrete railing, her knuckles turning white. Blood began to trickle from her nose again. She was pushing her biology to its absolute limit. The frequency was tearing at her own vocal cords. "Now, Brooks," she rasped, unable to hold the pitch much longer. Brooks stepped out from cover, raised his rifle, and fired a single, heavy-caliber round directly into the vibrating, stressed central strut of the skylight. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The acoustic stress, violently released by the kinetic impact of the bullet, caused the entire dome to fail simultaneously. With a deafening roar, thousands of pounds of shattered architectural glass rained down into the atrium like a glittering, lethal waterfall. Silas and his men looked up a fraction of a second too late. The glass crashed down upon them, crushing them beneath its weight, severing the communications array, and burying the rebellion in a tomb of jagged shards. Sloane collapsed onto the floor of the mezzanine, gasping for air, her throat burning like fire. Brooks was at her side instantly, scooping her into his arms, checking her pulse, wiping the blood from her face. "You did it," Brooks whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "You did it, my fierce, beautiful weapon." Sloane smiled weakly, closing her eyes. The immediate threat was gone. The estate was quiet again, but as she listened to the silence, her left ear gave one final, weak twitch. "Brooks," she whispered hoarsely. "Silas." His heartbeat. It didn't stop. Brooks's blood ran cold. He looked down into the devastated atrium. The air was thick with dust and the groans of dying men, but through the wreckage, a figure was dragging himself out from under a collapsed steel beam. Silas. His armor was shredded, his face a bloody ruin, but he was alive, and he was raising a weapon toward the mezzanine. "Move!" Brooks roared, tackling Sloane to the floor just as Silas fired a burst of automatic fire that chewed through the concrete railing where they had been standing. "He's using an adrenaline stim," Sloane gasped, her hearing pinpointing the unnatural, frantic racing of Silas's heart. "He's artificially keeping himself conscious. He's coming up the stairs." Brooks checked his weapon. He had half a magazine left. He looked at Sloane. She was spent, shivering from the biological backlash of using her power. She couldn't fight anymore. "Stay here," Brooks commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. The Alpha King was taking over. "Do not move. I will end this." Before she could protest, Brooks vaulted over the remaining concrete barrier, sliding down the rubble-strewn stairwell to meet the traitor head-on. Sloane lay on the mezzanine floor, helpless. Her throat was too damaged to project another sound. But she wasn't deaf. She closed her eyes and became the silent witness to the brutal clash of alphas. She heard them collide on the landing. It wasn't a gunfight anymore. It was animalistic. She heard the heavy thud of fists against armor, the feral snarls that tore from their throats as they abandoned tactical finesse for raw, territorial dominance. "You're weak, Brooks," Silas spat, his voice wet with blood. "You bring an Omega into the war room. You let a debt dictate your strategy. The council is laughing at you. She's worth 10 of you, Silas." Brooks roared back, the sound followed by a sickening crunch of cartilage. "You sold out your pack for a seat at a table that will never respect you." Sloane listened, her heart aching. Brooks was fighting for his life, but he was also fighting for her honor. He was defending her worth to a man who only saw her as property. She focused her hearing, trying to find an advantage. Silas was bigger, hopped up on combat stims, and fighting with nothing to lose. Brooks was exhausted, bleeding from multiple wounds. Then, she heard it. The faint, rhythmic beep. 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 Coming from Silas's tactical vest. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was electronic. "Brooks!" Sloane screamed, her ruined vocal cords tearing, producing an agonizing raspy screech. His vest. He has a dead man's switch. Explosives. The warning came just in time. Below, Silas had managed to pin Brooks against the wall, a combat blade raised to strike. But at Sloane's scream, Brooks understood the game. Silas wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to take Brooks down with him. Instead of blocking the knife, Brooks dropped his weight, slipping under Silas's guard. He grabbed the traitor by the tactical harness and used Silas's own forward momentum to hurl him over the edge of the stairwell landing. Silas plummeted the remaining 30 feet down into the glass-filled crater of the atrium. Brooks hit the deck, covering his head. 3 seconds later, the explosive strapped to Silas detonated. The blast wave ripped through the lower levels of High Ridge, blowing out the remaining windows and sending a plume of fire and smoke up through the ruined skylight. The mezzanine shook violently, throwing Sloane against the back wall. The noise was apocalyptic, overwhelming her sensitive ears, sending her into a spiral of darkness. When the ringing finally subsided, the estate was deathly quiet. Sloane forced her eyes open. Dust choked the air. "Brooks?" she rasped, terror gripping her chest. She listened desperately. Nothing. No movement. No breathing. "Brooks!" she cried out again, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. Then, a slow, heavy rhythm emerged from the silence. Thump, thump, thump. A strong, steady heartbeat. From the smoke of the stairwell, a massive, imposing figure emerged. Brooks. His suit was destroyed. He was covered in blood and ash, and he looked like a demon walking out of hell. But he was alive. He climbed the remaining stairs, his eyes locking onto her. He fell to his knees beside her, his large hands gently cupping her face. "I'm here," he breathed, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "It's over, Sloane. It's finally over." He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent not to claim her, but to ground himself. And for the first time, Sloane wrapped her arms around the Alpha King, holding him just as tightly. The debt was gone. The war was won. Only the two of them remained. The morning sun crept over the mountains, casting harsh light on the shattered glass of High Ridge Estate. Sloane sat on the terrace of the West Wing, wrapped in a blanket, savoring the cool, silent air. The sliding glass door opened, and Brooks stepped out. Stripped of his corporate veneer, he looked every bit the hardened survivor. Vance secured the perimeter. Brooks said quietly, leaning against the balustrade next to her. "The council wants to negotiate. I will dictate terms. I'm abolishing the flesh markets. Effective immediately." Sloane stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. "You're changing the laws of the syndicate?" "I'm burning the old ledger," Brooks confirmed. He pulled out the debt contract Marcus had signed. With a flick of his silver lighter, the proof of her servitude turned to ash. "You are a free woman, Sloane. If you want to leave, Vance has a car waiting. A new identity, clean money, and a quiet place where no one will ever hunt you." Sloane looked at the man who had bled for her. She didn't hear a lie in his heartbeat, only absolute, terrifying vulnerability. "My hearing is an asset, but it's also a curse," Sloane said softly, standing up and letting the blanket fall. "The world is too loud out there, but here, the rhythm makes sense." She stepped closer, resting her hand over his heart. "I don't want a quiet place. I want to stand beside the king who burned the ledger for me." With a low groan, Brooks's restraint finally snapped. He pulled her into a desperate, passionate kiss, a collision of two equals who had survived a war together. "Are you sure?" he murmured against her forehead. "My world is not a safe place, Sloane. I know." She smiled, her kaleidoscopic eyes shining. "But they don't know I can hear them coming." 3 months later, the rebuilt boardroom of the Obsidian Tower was thick with fear. The cartel heads sat around the massive mahogany table, terrified not just of Brooks, the Alpha King, but of the woman at his side. Sloane sat proudly in a tailored slate-gray suit, radiating the protective scent of Brooks's bonded mate. "The new terms are non-negotiable," Brooks stated calmly. "Territorial borders are finalized. The flesh trade is permanently shuttered." Any cartel caught dealing in Omega trafficking will be dismantled personally. Volkov, the southern boss, shifted uncomfortably. Brooks, be reasonable. The market demands. Sloane picked up a silver pen and tapped it once against the marble. Tap. Brooks smiled. My queen hears the spike in your heart rate, Volkov. She knows you have 2 shipments of undocumented Omegas sitting in a harbor warehouse right now. Volkov turned pale. I can reroute the ships. Consider the trade closed. Excellent, Brooks said. The table remained deadly silent. A new era had begun. As the meeting adjourned and the bosses fled, Brooks turned to Sloane, pulling her into his lap. You terrified them, he chuckled. They forgot that sometimes the things you buy have teeth. Sloane replied, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. He kissed the delicate tip of her ear. Not teeth, my love. You have something much sharper. Sloane smiled. She was no longer a debt or a weapon. She was the queen of the Northern Syndicate, and with her Alpha King, she was finally untouchable. Sloane and Brooks's journey proves that our greatest perceived weaknesses, the very things society might label as defects, can become our most devastating strengths when placed in the right environment. True power isn't about dominance or ownership. It's about mutual respect, trust, and the courage to rewrite the rules of a broken system. The debt Brooks bought turned out to be the salvation he didn't know he needed, proving that love and equality are the ultimate weapons against corruption. If you enjoyed this cinematic tale of power, betrayal, and shifting dynamics, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more intense original stories.